Welcome back to our Journey of a Lifetime study. We're in Lesson 8 in this session, discussing the books of Judges and Ruth. Now, the book of Judges, if you look at the top of page 34 in your book, it says it continues the story of the Israelites from after the death of Joshua all the way until the beginning of the kingly times. And you can see the key verse that sort of describes this book of Judges is found in two places, in chapter 17, verse 6, and also in chapter 21. Here's what that verse says. I'll give you the suggested answer as I read the full verse as it's written in chapter 17, verse 6. That verse says this: "In those days, that is the days of the judges, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So every man just did what was right in their own eyes. There was no centralized authority. The religious and moral bankruptcy is going to become just amazingly widespread. And as it says here, this book, you'll see some commentators refer to it really as the Dark Ages, because the morality just was unbelievably corrupt, and the following of heathen gods and the forgetting of God's law. And then we're going to see this process. Now, this process, the reason I have 6x here is because this process happens about 6 times in the book of Judges. And I put this as the cycle of national sin that we see. So the first thing that we're going to see in each of these cycles is that a generation comes up that forgets God's ways and God's law. And because of that, then they do the second thing, which is they begin to follow the religions, the idolatry, and the immorality of the other peoples that are around them. And that results in God disciplining them, and He uses the pagan countries to come in and to oppress them, to control them. And then what happens as a result of that, then the Israelites, who have been living very sinful and immoral lives, worshiping idols, are sort of disciplined out of that, and they begin to cry out to God for help. And then as they do that, God raises up a deliverer. Now, this deliverer is what is called a judge. And when we see this word judge, it's not a judge like we think about it. It's more of a deliverer, a person who God spoke to and raised up, and He used that person to organize or to do something that resulted in the casting off of the oppression of the people that God was using to discipline the nation of Israel. So after this deliverer rise up, then we see that there's repentance in the nation, a turning back to God, and that there's a deliverance, usually in the form of a battle or something like that, where they throw off the oppression. And then we see, finally, there's a season of peace. So as I said, they're going to go through this cycle of national sin 6 times in the book of Judges, which takes place, as you can see there, the bottom of page 34, that this book covers a span of 250 years, as I said, from the time of the death of Joshua until the time that that Samuel, the priest Samuel, the chief priest, is going to anoint Saul as the first king of Israel. Let's look at the bottom of page 34. You can see that there are 3 parts: the apostasy, the period of the judges, which covers these cycles, and then the appendix. And the appendices in chapter 17 through 21, it's really just 2 stories that epitomize how immoral the nation of Israel had become. So let's look first at the first chapter, which talks about the apostasy. Now, apostasy just means the turning away. As it says, much of the promised land had not been conquered at the death of Joshua. The first act of the Israelites was to seek God's will as to how they should begin the final conquest. God appointed Judah, the kingly tribe, to attack first, and the work began well, but it ended in failure. Now turn to the top of page 35. We see a list in the end of chapter 1 of all the places that the Israelites were not fully obedient. They sort of were 90% in some places, 70, maybe 95, but they did not finish well. And here's what happened in verses 28. It says that they let some of the peoples that they were supposed to completely destroy or chase out, that they let them remain. And they, instead of kicking them out, they made them into slaves, or they made them just pay taxes or tributes. And then we see in chapter 2, verse 3, that an angel of the Lord came to them and said this would be the result of these sins. That they would be thorns. That is, these people that they had allowed to live amongst them, that they made into slaves, that they had were forced to do tribute, that they would become a thorn in the Israelites, and that the gods of these people would become a snare. And of course, that was exactly what was going to happen. As the children of Israel began to, some cases, intermarry with these people, or just to be influenced by these gods that had been there before the Israelites arrived, and then they would fall into sin and go through this cycle that we've talked about already. Now, the sixth verse of chapter 2, we see the beginning of this cycle with the first judge. Now, we're going to look at all of them in just a moment. Before I do, you hear a lot of mention of the Baal, B-A-A-L, and the Ashereth pole. Now, these are just pagan gods or pagan ways. Baal literally just means the owner of the Lord. And so these pagan gods were people, they would pay tributes to these gods because they would think that these gods controlled these areas. So there were all kinds of sexually immoral things that they would do to make sure their crops grew, things that they would do for fertility and all these sorts of things. So the Baal, whenever we see the B-A-A-L, the Baal or Baal, were simply the local pagan gods. And as they began to worship them, they would mix it first with the worship of God. And in some cases, we'll see, they would completely forget about following God and would turn to the religions of the people who were living there. And as it mentions here in the middle of page 35, it's important to remember that Jerusalem wasn't conquered yet. There was no functioning Jerusalem. There was no capital city. There was no central government among the people of Israel. So there was no unity among the tribes. Each of the tribes, and inside of the tribes, even some of the people would just kind of do their own thing. Now let's turn to page 37. If you'll turn to page 37 with me, and you'll see there a list of 6. Now I said there are 12, and that's right, there are 12 judges that are listed. These are 6. You can think of these as the major or the primary judges that are mentioned. We're going to look at these one at a time. First of all, we have first guy here that you can fill out. It's called Othniel. Now, Othniel, as it says here, was Caleb's nephew, and it only has 3 verses about what he did, so we don't know much about him. But we do know that there was this oppression that came, and that Othniel was raised up by God, and that he led the battle. The same process led a battle fighting against their oppressors, and it also led to a season of repentance. And then we see after that, you can see right here, 40 years as a judge. Now, what that represents is he was sort of in charge, was the appointed leader, and in that time, it says that the land had rest, or there was peace in the land for the rest of the life of Othniel. Then there's the second guy. Now, he's an interesting character. His name was Ehud, and he's from the tribe of Benjamin, which we're going to talk about at the end of the book. The tribe of Benjamin was a pretty small one, and the story is that Ehud was used. He was a left-handed man, so he sort of did this mission where he went into the oppressors, the king's palace of the people who were oppressing them, who had taken over their lands and were subjecting them to slavery and labor and those sorts of things. And he went in, and in some sort of a secret mission, he was left-handed and no one knew it, so he had a sword strapped to his leg, or an 18-inch dagger, and he went in, and the king at that time was a really fat guy, and so while he was distracting him with his right hand, he used his left hand to get the dagger, and then he stabbed and killed that king. And they were alone, so he locked the doors, and then he escaped. And then later they found that king had been killed, and then Ehud, by that time, had gone back to his tribe in Benjamin and rounded up all the men and said he had assassinated their king, and it was time to attack, and they did. And again, we see that he served as judge for 80 years. And again, we don't have that much information about him. There are about 18 verses. Then we have the next guy, which is named Shamgar. Now, we don't know much about Shamgar at all. Just mentioned in one verse. We just know that he slew or killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And then we have the next one, which here it's Deborah. Now, you might also add the name Barak. Deborah, and this is the name you can add to there. They sort of worked as a team. Now, Barak was a man, and he was the one that was supposed to go do it, and he didn't want to do it. He was afraid, so he went to Deborah, who was a prophetess, And he asked if she would go, and she said she wouldn't go, but if she did it, then people would know that he had been a coward, and that she would get the credit, which of course is exactly what happened. And so she, of course, is recognized as the only woman judge, and then she, as it says here, served as a judge over the people for 40 years. The next one, which is the next two we're going to cover, are probably the most famous. Gideon, of course. Now, Gideon means the small man, and Gideon, if you read that story, the story reads like this, that Gideon was the smallest man and the most insignificant family of the smallest tribe of Manasseh. And so he was found, and the Philistines were coming in and raiding all of the camps, and so he was trying to thresh out wheat in the middle of a wine press, which is impossible. Wine presses were always in a low place surrounded by rocks, and wheat was usually threshed up on a hill where the wind would blow. And so God finds him there. And of course, God sort of, almost with a sense of humor, calls him mighty man of God. And Gideon, of course, if you know the story, the smallest man, the most insignificant family in this minor tribe would lead the people, and God would call him, and he would miraculously call tens of thousands of soldiers to come, but then God would wean that down and say that's too many soldiers, and finally with just, as it says here, 300 men, he went against the Midianites, which were the oppressors. I said Philistines earlier, but it was the Midianites in this case who were coming in and oppressing the people of Manasseh. And then, of course, who is probably the most famous judge or deliverer is Samson. Now, one of the interesting things as you go down through these stories is that you see that each of these people seem to be less and less moral. And so this story, as we go through each of these cycles, each of them shows that they're becoming more and more immoral. Let me show you a quick map here. And again, I get this out of the Holman Bible Atlas. This just shows a picture of where the judges were. You can see the color coding is showing where the different tribes were settled. And if you remember, we talked about last week that the Levitical cities were in different places so that the Levites could serve as priests. And then now what you see, each of these white boxes is one of those 12 judges. And so the main thing, the reason I want to show this map is for you to recognize that it happened all over. There wasn't just sort of one judge that came from one place and saved all of Israel. Most of these stories happened, up here or down here in different places. And so that judge would usually not round up everyone in Israel. He would usually just round up the people in just the area where he was to fight against. You have the Moabites, Edomites, the Ammonites, which are all around here, which were attacking them and oppressing them. And of course, the Philistines did it from within. So you can see there, each one of those white boxes shows you the geography of where that judge, that deliverer, where God used him to lead in repentance and deliverance, as we talked about here. Now, finally, at the end of the book, we have two really sad stories. The first one you can see at the bottom of page 35. We have a family of a man named Micah, and it's a really sad story, which I'm going to tell just briefly. In chapter 17, there's a family, and remember the picture's just showing how corrupt, how just mixed up these people have gotten. So there's a family, and the family, the son steals all this silver, and then he confesses to his mom, and his mom says, may Jehovah, we talked about last week, may Jehovah bless you. And so she said, this shows how confused they were. Take those 200 pieces of silver, take them to a metal smith, and have him make it into an idol. And we're going to bring these idols into our house. And they do that, and then they meet a young Levi. Now remember, Levi is supposed to be the one that is leading the people in the worship of Jehovah. But they catch this young Levite and ask him if he will be the priest of their house of idols. So you have this Levitical priest that is supposed to be keeping people pointed towards God, and he accepts the job to go and serve as a priest over this house, which is full of these idols which they had made. So they're still using the name Jehovah, but they're mixing it with all these weird sort of religions. And then we have this tribe of Dan, this larger tribe that comes in and raids the house and takes the idols and takes the priests. But the point is this: the whole place is just totally messed up and confused. They're still using the words Jehovah and using the priestly thing, but they're using them in a syncretized way where they're using idolatry and things like that. And then, of course, that leads to the final story, which is the saddest of them all. One of these Levites who's traveling through, and he purchases a concubine, which means basically just a girl slave. And as he's traveling through, he stops in a town in the middle of the tribe of Benjamin. And I'll show you a picture just so you understand where a lot of these things happen. This is a picture, a cropped picture of what we looked at last week. And we're going to end up in Bethlehem when we get to the book of Ruth. But he was traveling to Bethlehem, and on his way to Bethlehem, he stopped in the tribe of Benjamin, which was right up here around Jericho. Remember, Jerusalem was not the capital yet at that time. So he stopped in that area at a town, and as he did with his concubine, with his young girl slave, the people of the town square, now it's the picture of like Sodom and Gomorrah. The men come in, and they say, we want to give us this priest and this girl, and so the homeowner offers to give his daughter or the concubine, and they can have her if they'll leave this man, this priest, alone. Now remember, these are Israelites. These are the people in Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. And so, long story short, they take the young concubine, and all night long in the city square, they rape her, and then the next morning she's dead. And they leave her on the front porch of the house, the dead body of the girl. So this Levite priest takes the body of this concubine, of his young girl slave. He is so appalled. Of course, he's already the appalling, having purchased a slave girl. That's the whole point of it all. I mean, it's just completely immoral. And so what he does to show everyone in the nation of Israel how corrupt people have become is he takes the dead body of this young girl, and he cuts her body into 12 pieces, basically cuts it limb from limb, and then he sends the different pieces all over the entire nation of Israel, as he says that no one, it has never been heard of this kind of sin in all of Israel. And people descend on, and they essentially wipe out a large part of the tribe of Benjamin. The rest of the tribes do, because of this evil act. And that brings us to the end of the book. And it ends with the phrase that we talked about earlier. It ends with the phrase where we began. And I want to read this as we transition to the book of Ruth. The final verse in Judges sadly says this: in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So there's no leadership. The sacrificial system, the Levitical system is completely bankrupt as we come to the end of the book of Judges. And each of these cycles we go through, you see the country just going kind of down, down, down. But then we come to the book of Ruth. And as I left this up here, Ruth takes place in the town of Bethlehem, and we have the Moabites down here, which live down here south of Nebo. And they're going to be a part of the story as well. So top of page 36. Talk a little bit about the book of Ruth. Now, here's what I would suggest to you as the summary of the book as I understand it. The book is Ruth lived in this time. We don't know exactly when she lived, but she lived during the book of Judges. So in this time of really horrible moral decay, we see what is one of the most beautiful stories in the Bible, love stories, how God was faithful, and how this woman Ruth, who was a Moabitess, she was not a native Israelite, of how God used her, and she, as we saw last week, and we're going to see in just a moment, becomes one important mother and grandmother of some important descendants in Israel. But the summary, I would say, is that even in times of widespread national corruption, God works in the lives of families who are following Him. And of course, I think that's very important for us these days. If you want to complain about our culture, and there's lots of things to complain about, we should always remember this story in Ruth, that even in the midst of just national corruption, that God is still working among His people and the individuals and the families of His people. Now the events, as it says here, under the subtitle of the book of Ruth. It says, the events in the book of Ruth take place in the days of the judges, but what a difference we see. Instead of violence and immorality, we read of tenderness and love. It is a story of a godly family from what famous city in Judah? The city was Bethlehem. Now, the family from Bethlehem, his name was Elimelech, as you see here, which, by the way, it means El means God, and then Melech means king, and the I in the middle means my. So the name Elimelech, really it's fascinating, means Elohim, God is my king. That's the name of the husband. And he had married a woman, Naomi, and they moved down to where we talked about. I'll go back here on the map. They moved down here into this area. They moved from Bethlehem. They moved down here into this area. And while they were there, Elimelech, something happens. And we read about there in chapters 1, verse 3 and 5. I'll flip back up to those. We see that Naomi's husband, Elimelech, and her 2 sons all died. So her 2 sons had taken wives, and whenever they lived in that area in the Moab, and so as the sons had died, so they had the 2 widows. Her 2 daughter-in-laws, who had both become widows, were with her. And she told them to both go on because there's nothing for her. She was going to go back to Bethlehem, to her hometown, and she told them to just stay. But then we see one, Oprah, that she went back to her people, the Moabites. But Ruth, who was a Moabite, she wasn't an Israelite, she refused to leave Naomi. And then we have, as you'll see, this middle paragraph on page 36, and in parentheses, or excuse me, in italics, we'll see a quote of that passage, which is, as it says here, is often read in weddings. Let's read that together. It says, the words Ruth spoke to Naomi are often used in wedding ceremonies. Ruth said this, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if I ought but death part thee and me. And so when they returned to Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth, of course, are very poor, and so Naomi told Ruth that she should go out and she could, how they would take care of the poor back then, as if you had, and of course this was someone who's poor, not just of tragedy, not anything of their own doing. And so Ruth would go out, and when they would go behind the people as they were harvesting the wheat, she could pick up any of the wheat that the harvesters dropped. And of course, you probably know the story in this process. Ruth ends up catching the eye of Boaz, who is the landowner, and he is one of their relatives. She won his heart, and eventually they were married in a wonderful love story. Now, as we talked about last week, you can see the bottom of page 36. So Boaz and Ruth were married, and they had a son, and their son was named Obed. Now, Obed, remember we're in Bethlehem, right? Obed had a son, and that son's name was Jesse. And then Jesse had a number of sons, 8 sons, and his youngest son was named David, who would become the king. So you can remember that connection that we showed last week, that we drew out on the board, showing this, how God uses not only Rahab, the prostitute last week, but eventually, of course, he uses Ruth, the Moabitess, who's not an Israelite, and used them in the lineage, not only of David, it would be the lineage, as we saw last week in Matthew, the lineage of Jesus himself. Finally, at the bottom of page 36, we read, this book establishes a lineage of ancestors from Jesus Christ. We can see God at work, keeping the promises he made in Genesis 3:15 and in 22:15 through 18. I'm going to read these verses, and then I'll put it up here. I want you to listen carefully to the verses as I read them. Genesis 3:15, this was right after the fall of Adam and Eve. God says this, I will put an enmity, which means a deep hostility, a hatred between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He, that is, one day this offspring will bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So the picture of even after that fall, that God talks to Satan and says, one day a descendant of this woman is going to devastate you, when you're going to injure him, but he's going to crush or bruise your head. And then we see that continued in Genesis chapter 22, when God is speaking to Abraham. And listen to what God tells Abraham. He says, I will surely bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring, listen to this promise, in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. To summarize those two verses, we see that through a woman, one would be born who would destroy the power of Satan. And all of the nations of the world would be blessed through this seed. And so we see here these two books. And remember, I'll go back over here to our library. We finished the 5 books of Moses, the law, and we looked last week at Joshua. And today we looked at Judges and Ruth. And just remember, Judges and Ruth go together. The story of Ruth takes place inside of the history book of Judges. And we'll come back in our next lesson and begin the next history book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Thank you.